The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Ridgefield, a small town nestled in the heart of the countryside. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors chatted over white picket fences, and life seemed to move at a slower, more peaceful pace. In one of the modest houses on Elm Street, Jorge Santos and his son, Gabriel, lived a life that appeared, to everyone else, perfectly ordinary. Jorge was a man in his mid-40s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed older than his age. His face was lined with the marks of stress and sleepless nights, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. He was known around town as a hard worker, someone who kept to himself but was always willing to lend a hand if someone needed it. After his wife, Marina, died in a tragic car accident, Jorge had been left alone to raise Gabriel, who was just a toddler at the time. Despite the heartache, he had done his best to give his son a loving home, shielding him from the darker aspects of their reality. Gabriel was now 8 years old, a bright and joyful child with dark, curly hair and a smile that could melt even the coldest hearts. He was full of energy, always running around the neighborhood with his friends, playing soccer in the park, and riding his bike down the quiet streets. To the other parents, Gabriel was a sweet, well-behaved boy who always had a kind word for everyone. He was the kind of child who would bring home stray animals, insisting they needed care, and would spend hours building forts out of cardboard boxes in the backyard. The bond between Jorge and Gabriel was strong, almost unbreakable. Every morning, Jorge would wake up early to prepare breakfast, making Gabriel's favorite pancakes, and they would eat together before Jorge headed off to work. Evenings were spent playing board games or watching old cartoons, and every night, Jorge would tuck Gabriel into bed, telling him stories about adventures and far-off places. It was their routine, their way of holding on to a semblance of normalcy. But behind the smiles, Jorge was fighting a losing battle. After Marina's death, their financial situation had taken a sharp decline. Jorge had never been a wealthy man, but now, without a second income, things had gone from bad to worse. The life insurance payout from Marina's accident had been used up quickly, first on funeral expenses, then on debts that had been accumulating even before her death. Jorge had taken out loans to keep their home, thinking he would be able to pay them off, but as the months passed, the debts only grew. Every month was a struggle to make ends meet. Jorge worked long hours at a local hardware store, but the paycheck barely covered their basic needs. He picked up odd jobs on the weekends, mowing lawns and fixing fences for extra cash, but it was never enough. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, and every envelope felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Late at night, when Gabriel was fast asleep, Jorge would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the overdue notices, wondering how much longer he could keep everything together. Despite the stress, Jorge made sure Gabriel never saw the cracks in their life. He hid his worries behind a smile, keeping up the facade of a loving, stable household. He wanted his son to have a normal childhood, free from the fears and anxieties that haunted his own thoughts. To Gabriel, their life was simple but happy. He didn't understand why his father would sometimes stay up late, why he would get phone calls that left him looking pale and nervous, or why they couldn't afford the things that other kids had. The neighbors, too, were largely unaware of the struggles Jorge faced. They saw a man who had endured the loss of his wife but had carried on, doing his best to raise his son alone. When Jorge's car broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it, a few people offered him rides, and when he missed a neighborhood barbecue because he had to work, they nodded sympathetically, understanding that he was doing what he had to do to get by. But no one knew just how dire the situation had become. There was one particular afternoon that marked a turning point for Jorge. It was a Saturday, and Gabriel was outside playing with his friends, his laughter echoing through the street. Jorge had just received another letter, this one more threatening than the others. It was from a loan shark he had borrowed money from in a moment of desperation. The letter was a final warning, stating that if he didn't come up with the money soon, there would be serious consequences. Jorge's hands trembled as he read it, a cold sweat forming on his forehead. He felt trapped, suffocated by the impossible weight of his debts. For the first time, Jorge allowed himself to think about a future where he might lose everything. The thought terrified him. He imagined losing the house, the place where Gabriel had grown up, where he still kept a photo of Marina on the living room wall, smiling as if nothing had ever gone wrong. He imagined having to uproot Gabriel's life, taking him away from his school, his friends, everything he knew. And in that moment, something inside him broke. That evening, as Jorge sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of hopelessness that he had never felt before. It was as if the world was closing in on him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way out. He glanced at Gabriel, who was still playing, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing around them. Jorge knew he needed to protect his son, to keep him safe, but he didn't know how much longer he could pretend everything was okay. That night, after Gabriel had gone to bed, Jorge received a call from a man he hadn't spoken to in years. It was Marcos, a name he had hoped to forget. Marcos had a reputation for getting involved in less than legal activities, and Jorge had distanced himself from that world a long time ago. But now, with his back against the wall, Jorge listened as Marcos made him an offer, one that would set him on a path he could never have imagined. The offer was simple, yet chilling. Marcos knew a couple who was willing to pay a substantial amount of money for a child. They had tried adopting legally but had faced numerous obstacles, and they were desperate enough to look for other means. "They'll give you enough to clear your debts and more," Marcos said, his voice smooth, as if he were discussing a simple business transaction. "Think about it, Jorge. This could solve all your problems." Jorge hung up the phone, his hands shaking. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. The idea was monstrous, unimaginable. But as the hours passed and the weight of his financial troubles pressed down on him, he found himself unable to dismiss the possibility entirely. It was as if the world had pushed him to the edge of a cliff, and now he was looking down, wondering if he had any other choice but to jump. As he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, Jorge felt more alone than ever. He thought about Marina, about how she would have been able to find a solution, how she would have known what to do. But she was gone, and he was the only one left to take care of Gabriel. The boy deserved a better life than the one Jorge could give him, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make that happen. For the first time, Jorge allowed himself to consider the unthinkable, and as the darkness closed in around him, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The days after Marcos's phone call were a blur of anxiety and guilt for Jorge. He tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but his mind was constantly drawn back to the conversation. Every time he thought about what Marcos had suggested, he felt a mix of disgust and desperation. Selling his own son? It was an idea so horrifying that it made him feel physically sick. Yet, as the days passed, the gnawing fear of losing everything continued to cloud his judgment. The phone calls from debt collectors became more frequent, their tone increasingly menacing. The loan shark who had sent the final warning wasn't someone to be taken lightly. Jorge knew stories of what happened to people who crossed him, and the thought of being at the mercy of such a man terrified him. He imagined Gabriel seeing him hurt, or worse, and it filled him with dread. The walls were closing in, and every potential solution seemed to slip through his fingers, leaving him feeling more trapped than ever. One evening, Jorge decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, to breathe and think away from the suffocating environment of his home. He ended up at a bar on the edge of town, a place he rarely visited, but that night he needed a drink to calm his nerves. The dimly lit room was filled with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and the dull murmur of conversations offered a kind of strange comfort. As he nursed his drink, he noticed a familiar figure sitting in a booth near the back, Marcos. Marcos's face lit up when he saw Jorge, as if he had been expecting him. He motioned for Jorge to join him, and after a moment's hesitation, Jorge slid into the booth. Marcos had an air of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you have something someone else desperately needs. He wasted no time, leaning forward and speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone. "Jorge, I know you've been thinking about my offer," he said, his eyes locking onto Jorge's. "And I can see it's eating you up. But let me tell you something. Sometimes, you have to do whatever it takes to survive. The world doesn't care about your morals when you're out on the street, with nothing to your name." Jorge didn't respond. He just stared at his drink, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to tell Marcos to shut up, to leave him alone. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, because a part of him, a small, desperate part, was listening. Marcos took Jorge's silence as a sign to continue. The couple I mentioned, they're not bad people. They're just in a difficult situation. They've been trying to adopt for years, but the system has made it impossible for them. They have money, more than you can imagine, and they're willing to make this easy. They don't want trouble, just a chance to have a family. And you, my friend, you need money. A lot of it. Think about what this could mean for you. For Gabriel, Jorge's heart pounded in his chest. Marcos's words were calculated, manipulative, but there was a cruel logic to them. He had no one to turn to, no one to help him out of the pit he had fallen into. What kind of future could he offer Gabriel? More struggling, more sleepless nights, more fear? Marcos was offering him a way out, a way to give his son a life without hardship. But at what cost? As if sensing Jorge's hesitation, Marcos leaned back and smiled. Look, I'm not here to pressure you. I'm just laying out the facts. If you want, I can arrange a meeting with the couple. You can see for yourself. No commitment, just a conversation. They're decent people, and they'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. Jorge didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say no, to reject the whole thing and walk away. But he also wanted to at least know who these people were, to understand what exactly he was being asked to do. Maybe if he met them, he could find a way to convince them to back out, to make them see how wrong this was. Or maybe he was just trying to rationalize his own curiosity, to justify his own weakness. After what felt like an eternity, Jorge nodded, barely able to speak. Fine, I'll meet them. But that doesn't mean I'm agreeing to anything. Marcos's smile widened, as if he had been expecting that answer all along. Of course. I'll set it up. And don't worry, Jorge, this will all be very discreet. No one needs to know. A few days later, Marcos arranged for Jorge to meet the couple at a discreet location, a small, upscale cafe in a neighboring town, far enough from Ridgefield that no one would recognize him. Jorge arrived early, his hands clammy and his stomach twisted in knots. He had thought about canceling 100 times, but each time he had found himself unable to do it. He needed to know what kind of people would want to buy a child. When the couple arrived, Jorge was surprised by how normal they looked. They were well-dressed, polite, and even had an air of sophistication about them. The woman, Claire, was in her late 30s, with a kind smile and soft, gentle eyes. She introduced herself warmly, as if this were just a casual meeting between friends. Her husband, Richard, was a tall, serious-looking man, but he spoke in a calm, reassuring tone that immediately put Jorge on edge. There was something almost too perfect about them, like they were playing a role. "We want you to know," Claire began, her voice soothing, "that we're not looking to hurt anyone. We've wanted a child for so long, and the adoption process has been so difficult. We've been through heartbreak after heartbreak, and when we heard from Marcos that there might be an opportunity, we thought, maybe this is our chance. We can give your son a good life, Jorge. A life full of love, opportunities, everything you want for him but can't provide." Jorge listened, trying to gauge if there was any malice behind their words, but all he could see was desperation, a desperation that mirrored his own. Claire and Richard continued to talk, explaining how they had tried every legal route, how they had been denied over and over, and how this was their last hope. They made it sound as if they were the victims, as if Jorge would be doing them a favor by letting them take Gabriel. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locking with Jorge's. "We're prepared to offer you a substantial amount of money, enough to clear your debts, start fresh, and give you a new beginning. We're not trying to buy your son. We're trying to give him a future, and you as well." The offer was staggering. Jorge had never seen that much money in his life. It was enough to wipe out his debts, to keep his home, to live without the constant fear of losing everything. But the idea of selling Gabriel, of handing over his own son to strangers, made his skin crawl. He was torn, caught between the desire to protect his son's future and the crushing weight of his own reality. As they talked, Claire reached out and gently touched Jorge's hand. "You're not a bad person for considering this," she said softly. "You're just a father trying to do what's best for his son. And we're not bad people for wanting to give a child a loving home. We're all just trying to survive in our own way." Jorge pulled his hand away, feeling conflicted. He wanted to scream, to tell them how wrong this was, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just sat there, nodding mechanically as they continued to outline their plan. By the time the meeting ended, Jorge felt as if he were in a trance, as if the decision had already been made for him. He didn't remember agreeing to anything, but Marcos's smile when they parted ways told him that he had. That night, Jorge couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. Every time he thought about what he was about to do, he felt a wave of nausea, but he couldn't escape the reality of his situation. The debts, the threats, the fear of losing everything. It was all too much. In the darkness, he began to rationalize. Maybe this was the right thing. Maybe Gabriel would have a better life with Claire and Richard. They had money, they could give him things Jorge could never afford. A good education, a comfortable home, a future. Wasn't that what every parent wanted for their child? But deep down, Jorge knew he was trying to convince himself of a lie. He was doing this because he was scared, because he didn't see any other way out. And that realization broke him. He curled up in bed, sobbing quietly, ashamed of the man he had become, of the father he was failing to be. As the night dragged on, Jorge made his decision. He would go through with it. He would hand Gabriel over to Claire and Richard, and he would take the money. He would tell himself it was for Gabriel's sake, that it was to give him a better life. But he knew the truth. It was because he was too weak, too scared, to fight for another solution. In the morning, when Gabriel bounded down the stairs, full of energy and excitement, Jorge forced a smile. He hugged his son tightly, longer than usual, trying to memorize the feel of him, the warmth of his small body, the sound of his laughter. He wanted to remember it, to hold on to it, because he knew that soon it would be all he had left. And as Gabriel pulled away, looking up at his father with those bright, trusting eyes, Jorge's heart shattered, knowing that he was about to betray the one person who believed in him the most. The night after the meeting with Claire and Richard was one of the longest nights of Jorge's life. He hardly slept, drifting in and out of restless, haunted dreams. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Gabriel's face, heard his laughter echoing in his ears, and felt the cold grip of fear clenching his heart. He tried to imagine life without his son, and each time, the thought was unbearable. Yet the choice had been made, and deep down, Jorge felt like he was already past the point of no return. The exchange was scheduled to take place in a week, in a remote area on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Marcos had been adamant about the need for discretion, and Claire and Richard had assured Jorge that everything would be handled smoothly. Jorge was left with nothing to do but wait, counting down the days with a sense of impending doom. He tried to carry on as usual, going to work, cooking meals, and spending time with Gabriel, but every moment felt heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. During that week, Jorge went through a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to back out, to call Marcos and tell him the deal was off. But every time he considered it, he was reminded of the mountain of debts, the threats from the loan shark, and the fear of losing everything. He felt trapped, as if there were invisible hands pushing him toward a decision he could no longer control. The night of the exchange was dark and stormy, as if the weather itself mirrored Jorge's turmoil. He had told Gabriel they were going on a little adventure, that they were going to meet some friends. Gabriel, trusting and innocent, hadn't questioned it. He was excited, chattering away as they drove through the rain-soaked streets, his voice filling the car with a brightness that only deepened Jorge's sense of dread. They drove for over an hour, leaving the familiar streets of Ridgefield behind and heading into the countryside. The roads became narrower, the houses fewer and farther between. The rain hammered down on the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up, creating a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that seemed to drown out everything else. Jorge's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his mind racing with thoughts of what he was about to do. When they arrived at the designated spot, a lonely stretch of road near an abandoned gas station, Jorge parked the car and turned off the engine. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Jorge looked over at Gabriel, who was peering out the window, his face lit up with curiosity. "Are we here, Dad?" Gabriel asked, his voice bright and innocent. Jorge couldn't bring himself to answer. Instead, he reached over and gently placed a hand on Gabriel's head, ruffling his curly hair. "I love you, Gabriel," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I need you to remember that, okay?" Gabriel looked at his father, slightly confused but still smiling. "I love you too, Dad. Are we going to meet your friends now?" Jorge's heart ached. He wanted to scream, to grab Gabriel and drive as far away from this place as possible, but he was paralyzed by fear and despair. Before he could say anything, headlights appeared in the distance, slowly growing brighter as a car approached. Jorge swallowed hard, knowing it was too late to turn back. The car pulled up beside them, and Claire and Richard stepped out, both dressed in dark, rainproof coats. They had a calm, composed air about them, as if this were just a routine transaction. Claire approached Jorge's window and tapped on it lightly, her smile visible even through the dim light and rain. Jorge rolled down the window, his hands trembling. "You brought him," she said softly, her tone almost reassuring. "Thank you, Jorge. We promise you. This is the best thing for everyone." Jorge felt numb as he unbuckled Gabriel's seatbelt and helped him out of the car. Claire knelt down to Gabriel's level, speaking to him in a sweet, gentle voice. "Hi there, Gabriel. My name is Claire. We're going to take a little ride, okay? We have some fun things planned, and I think you're going to like it." Gabriel hesitated, glancing back at Jorge for reassurance. "Dad, are you coming too?" Jorge felt his throat close up. He forced a smile, trying to keep his voice steady. "Not right now, buddy. But I'll see you soon. Just be good, okay?" His voice cracked on the last word, and he had to look away, unable to meet his son's eyes. Claire took Gabriel's hand and led him to their car. As she did, Richard approached Jorge, carrying a suitcase. "As promised," he said, handing it over. "The full amount, in cash. We'll take care of everything from here." Jorge took the suitcase, the weight of it feeling both heavy and hollow. It was the solution to all his problems, yet it felt like a chain, binding him to an act he could never undo. He glanced over at Gabriel, who was now sitting in the back seat of Claire and Richard's car, looking confused and a little scared. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that instant, Jorge felt like he was being torn apart. "Wait," he said suddenly, his voice louder than he intended. I need a minute." Claire and Richard exchanged a glance, but didn't protest. Jorge walked over to the car and opened the door, crouching down to look at Gabriel. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." Gabriel reached out and hugged his father tightly, sensing that something was wrong but not understanding what. "It's okay, Dad," he said softly. "I'll see you soon, right?" Jorge hugged him back, holding on as if he could somehow transfer all his love, all his apologies, into that one embrace. "Yeah, buddy, I'll see you soon." As he stepped back, the rain intensified, blurring his vision. Claire gently guided Gabriel back into the car, and within moments, they were driving away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. Jorge stood there, drenched, the suitcase in his hand feeling like a lead weight. He felt like he had just torn out a piece of his own soul and watched it drive away, leaving him hollow and broken. The drive home was agonizing. The car felt empty, suffocating, and every mile brought a new wave of guilt crashing over Jorge. He wanted to turn around, to chase after them, to scream until his throat was raw, but he couldn't move. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare, one where he was powerless to change anything. When he finally arrived home, the house was dark and silent. It felt alien, as if it were no longer his. Jorge placed the suitcase on the kitchen table and stood there, staring at it. He opened it slowly, and the sight of the neatly stacked bills made him feel sick. This was the price of his betrayal, the cost of selling his own son. He thought about all the things he could do with the money: pay off the debts, fix up the house, maybe even start fresh somewhere new. But none of it mattered, because none of it could erase what he had done. Jorge collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For hours, he sat there in the dark, replaying the night over and over in his mind. He thought about Gabriel's smile, the way he had looked at him, the trust in his eyes. And with each memory, The guilt grew heavier, threatening to crush him. In the days that followed, Jorge tried to adjust to his new reality. He paid off all his debts, settling the accounts that had haunted him for so long. He fixed up the house, repaired the leaking roof, and even bought a new car. On the outside, it looked as if Jorge had finally gotten his life together. Neighbors who had once whispered about his struggles now nodded approvingly, happy to see that he was doing better. But inside, Jorge was falling apart. He avoided going out, avoiding conversations, afraid that someone might see through him, might ask about Gabriel. He told everyone the same story, that Gabriel had gone to live with relatives in another state, where he could have a better life. Most people believed him, but a few raised their eyebrows, questioning why there had been no goodbyes, no farewell party for the boy who had been a part of their community. The gossip started, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing day. Every night, Jorge sat in Gabriel's empty room, staring at the toys scattered on the floor, the bed that was still unmade, the little drawings pinned to the wall. He felt like he was drowning in memories, each one a reminder of what he had lost, of what he had done. The guilt gnawed at him, day and night, and no matter how much he tried to distract himself, it never went away. Jorge had thought that the money would bring him peace, that it would solve his problems. But all it had done was buy him a new kind of torment, one that he couldn't escape. He had betrayed his son, and there was no amount of money that could change that. And as the days turned into weeks, Jorge began to realize that he had lost far more than just his son. He had lost himself. A year passed, and life in the small town had returned to its usual rhythm. Jorge's name was no longer on the lips of gossiping neighbors, and people began to accept Gabriel's absence. But one day, a stranger arrived in town, sparking a new wave of curiosity. The man, who introduced himself as David, was a private investigator from another state. He asked around about Gabriel, showing people a photo of the boy and explaining that he had been hired by someone who wanted to make sure the child was okay. David's inquiries sent shockwaves through the community. People began to whisper, connecting dots that they hadn't before, and old suspicions resurfaced. David was methodical, spending weeks talking to everyone who might have known Jorge or Gabriel. He was patient, knowing that if there was a secret, someone would eventually slip. David's investigation led him to Marcos. After some pressure, Marcos admitted to arranging the illegal adoption but claimed he didn't know what happened to Gabriel after the exchange. With this information, David began digging deeper, uncovering a web of illegal adoptions that stretched across state lines. He traced the couple who had taken Gabriel and found out that they weren't just looking to adopt. They were part of a larger criminal network involved in child trafficking. David's discovery was horrifying. He realized that Gabriel wasn't just adopted. He had been sold into a dark, sinister world. Determined to find the boy, David continued his search, eventually locating a lead that brought him closer to the couple's whereabouts. But he knew he needed more evidence to bring them down and, more importantly, to expose the larger network behind them. News of David's investigation eventually reached Jorge. Terrified that his secret would come to light, Jorge tried to flee town, but it was too late. The police arrested him before he could make it to the city limits. During questioning, Jorge broke down, confessing everything. He told them about his desperation, about Marcos, and the couple he had met that fateful night. He was ashamed, but he claimed he had been told Gabriel would be given a good home, never suspecting the darker reality. The arrest was a sensation, and the small town was thrown into chaos. The once sympathetic image of Jorge was shattered, replaced by one of a desperate man who had done the unthinkable. But even as Jorge sat in a cell, waiting for his trial, David continued his search for Gabriel, refusing to give up on the boy. David's investigation led him across state borders, piecing together a trail of transactions, false documents, and bribes that spanned several cities. He realized that the network was much bigger than he had anticipated. With the help of law enforcement, he managed to identify other children who had been taken by the same group, and slowly, they began to dismantle the network. But there was still no sign of Gabriel, and every day that passed felt like a countdown against hope. One night, as David was reviewing the evidence, he found a small, overlooked detail in one of the documents, a location, scribbled hastily in the corner, that led him to an isolated house on the outskirts of a distant city. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead he had. David arrived at the house just before dawn, accompanied by law enforcement. They found several children inside, all scared and confused, but there was no sign of Gabriel. As they searched the property, they found a hidden room in the basement, and there, huddled in a corner, was the boy they had been looking for. Gabriel was weak, frightened, and disoriented, but he was alive. David felt a surge of relief wash over him as he carried the boy out of the darkness and into the light. It was a moment of triumph, but it was bittersweet. Gabriel had been through unimaginable trauma, and though he was safe, his innocence had been stolen. As Jorge's trial began, the courtroom was packed. The town had come to see the man they once knew, the father who had betrayed his own blood. During the trial, more information about the trafficking network came to light, revealing a complex operation that had been preying on vulnerable families for years. Jorge testified, sharing his story of desperation, but it did little to sway the jury's opinion. The prosecution played recordings of David's interviews with other families, painting a harrowing picture of the network's operations. Jorge was sentenced to several years in prison, but the true focus was on bringing down the ringleaders of the network, who were still at large. Months after the trial, David received a call from a hospital. Gabriel's health had been improving, but during a routine checkup, doctors discovered something shocking: a scar on his back that appeared to be from a surgical procedure. After further investigation, they found that Gabriel had been taken not just for adoption, but for something far more sinister: organ trafficking. The revelation was the final twist in a story that had already been filled with darkness. Gabriel had been sold to provide organs to wealthy clients, but by some miracle, he had been spared, likely because he was too young to undergo the procedure. This discovery led to another wave of arrests, exposing a hidden underworld that had remained in the shadows for far too long. David's relentless pursuit had not only saved Gabriel but had also helped to dismantle a criminal network that had destroyed countless lives. The story ended with the hope that Gabriel, now under the care of distant relatives, might one day find peace and healing, even after everything he had endured. As the credits roll on this harrowing tale, the audience is left with a mix of emotions: relief that justice was served, but also a deep sadness for the pain and suffering that so many innocent lives endured. It's a story of desperation, betrayal, and the resilience of the human spirit, with a final reminder that sometimes the darkest deals hide the darkest secrets.